We're going to talk about description in fiction. It is very important to describe the environment, the characters, and things like that to transport the reader. Because you might be imagining, if you're the sort of person who imagines scenes visually and auditorily, but your reader is not able to do that unless you give them clues about what is happening. So there are hard and fast rules on how to describe. So there are obvious things like if you begin every sentence with there is, it's not going to be very transportative. Uh, but the occasional there is sentence is fine. And similarly, it's a good idea to use strong words, something that you probably already have learned. So you could say he knocked softly, but why say that if you can say he tapped? Or why would you say she spoke softly versus she whispered? So sometimes this is again not an absolute thing, and sometimes she spoke softly is better than she whispered. It really all depends. And similarly, about the length of descriptions, you can have really short and few descriptions, and you can transport the reader in other ways, such as with witty dialogues, or you can have very long descriptions. It seems to be that in older novels you have longer descriptions than in contemporary novels, but again, it's really just up to you. And one aspect of descriptions that's often not emphasized enough is the way your writing sounds. And I'll just here quote from Steering the Craft, which is Ursula Le Guin's guide on how to write fiction. She talks about the sound of your writing, and I'll just quote at length because I think it's very useful. The sound of the language is where it all begins. The test of a sentence is, does it sound right? The basic elements of language are physical, the noise words make, the sounds and silences that make the rhythms marking their relationship. Both the meaning and the beauty of the writing depends on these sounds and rhythms. This is just as true of prose as it is of poetry, though the sound effects of prose are usually subtle and always irregular. Most children enjoy the sound of language for its own sake. They wallow in repetitions and luscious word sounds and the crunch and slither of onomatopoeia. They fall in love with musical or impressive words and use them in all the wrong places. Some writers keep this primal interest in and love for the sound of language, but others outgrow their oral sense of what they're reading or writing, and that's a dead loss. An awareness of what your own writing sounds like is an essential skill for a writer. Fortunately, it's quite easy to cultivate, to learn, or reawaken. A good writer, like a good reader, has a mind's ear. We mostly read prose in silence, but many readers have a keen inner ear that hears it. Dull, choppy, droning, jerky, feeble. These words of common criticism of narrative are all faults in the sound of it. Lively, well-paced, flowing, strong, beautiful. These are all qualities of the sound of prose, and we rejoice in them as we read. Narrative writers need to train their mind's ear to listen to their own prose, to hear as they write. So it's interesting to think about the rhythm, the sounds. Does it match the kind of thing that you're trying to describe? Does it clash with those things? That's one good way to get into descriptions. I'll just read a little fragment from Rosemary Sutcliffe's Blood and Sand. Rosemary Sutcliffe lived in England, and nevertheless she talks here about a military camp, El Hamet, and it's interesting to hear how she describes it. And here is a short scene very near the beginning of the book where she describes a military camp. Round one of the fires, just below the village gateway, and scarcely clear of the turbaned gravestones of the village dead, the best part of the Highlanders Grenadier Company were gathered. They had eaten their evening meal and fallen to their own affairs and pastime. Here a little clump of heads bent together over a greasy pack of cards. There a man playing dice by himself, left hand against right. A man singing softly for his own ear and no one else's. His gaze on the fire and his hands linked around his updrawn knees. Another doing his mending, and yet another writing a letter with frowning concentration, leaning forward, the page tipped to catch the flame light. One in deep conversation with a stray dog, the kind that always hung about an army camp. One who always suffered from religion on the eve of battle, reading his Bible. Most of the others silent or talking together idly as they readied their equipment for the morning. And this little passage also demonstrates that you don't really need personal experience or direct experience to write. So the dictum of write what you know sometimes can mean just do the research that is needed to make a vivid story. So, for example, Neil Gaiman wrote a story about graves playing in a graveyard, and he visited lots and lots of different graveyards. You can do research in other ways as well. You can sort of do archival or just internet searches, looking at pictures. So you can use all sorts of different ways, and keeping in mind that when you describe, it's important to not just describe visually, but also what goes on in sound and in touch and smells and tastes and other senses. The more you can marshal those effectively in your descriptions, the more lively the description will be.